Most people believe danger announces itself, that it comes with shouting, chaos, or visible warning signs. But sometimes the most terrifying crimes begin quietly, hidden inside ordinary routines that no one questions. This story begins like that, on a normal morning, in a normal neighborhood, where nothing seemed out of place until it was far too late. The house stood on a calm street, where neighbors waved politely and children rode their bikes after school. From the outside it looked like any other family home. There were no broken windows, no loud arguments spilling into the street, no reason for anyone to suspect that something deeply disturbing was unfolding behind its walls. Yet inside that house, a slow and calculated plan was already in motion. The man at the center of this story was known as reliable. He showed up on time, paid his bills, and kept to himself. Friends described him as quiet but polite. Co-workers saw him as someone who followed rules and avoided conflict. There was nothing about him that suggested violence, and that was exactly what allowed him to remain invisible. For years he lived a life that blended seamlessly into the background. He woke up early, followed a predictable routine, and returned home at the same time every evening. Neighbors noticed his consistency and mistook it for stability. What they didn't see was what happened when the doors were closed and the lights were off. Inside, control mattered more than anything else. Every detail of daily life had to go according to his expectations. When it didn't, frustration didn't explode outward. It turned inward, growing quietly, feeding resentment that no one else could see. Instead of arguments, there were long silences. Instead of confrontation, there was planning. The victim trusted him completely. That trust had been built over time, reinforced by familiarity, and the belief that someone you share your life with could never intentionally cause harm. That belief would become the most dangerous mistake of all. The relationship did not collapse suddenly. There were no dramatic breakups or public confrontations. Instead, it eroded slowly. Small disagreements became emotional distance. Emotional distance became isolation. The victim began pulling away, seeking independence, imagining a future that did not revolve around control. That shift was noticed immediately. What looked like withdrawal to outsiders felt like betrayal to him. He began to monitor behavior more closely, noticing patterns, changes in tone, time spent away from home. Each difference was interpreted as a threat, not a misunderstanding, a threat. Rather than addressing it, he started preparing. He researched quietly, late at night, using devices that no one else checked. He read about methods, timelines, and mistakes others had made. He learned what drew attention and what went unnoticed. His interest wasn't driven by impulse. It was driven by patience. Meanwhile, life on the surface continued as usual. He smiled when expected. He went to work. He answered questions with short, calm responses. No one suspected that every interaction was being evaluated, every future outcome rehearsed. The victim sensed something was wrong, but couldn't explain it. There was a constant feeling of being watched, of walking on invisible boundaries that shifted without warning. Friends were told everything was fine. After all, nothing specific had happened yet, and when nothing specific happens, people tend to wait. That waiting would cost everything. In the weeks leading up to the crime, his behavior became unusually calm. The tension that once filled the house seemed to disappear. Arguments stopped. Control appeared to loosen. This sudden change brought relief to the victim, who believed the worst had passed. In reality, the opposite was true. The plan was entering its final stage. He chose a day that blended perfectly into routine. No holidays, no events, just another day that wouldn't stand out in memory. He made sure his schedule appeared normal, that there would be nothing suspicious about where he was or what he was doing. That morning he acted kind. He spoke gently. He avoided conflict entirely. This was not remorse, it was precision. He needed trust to remain intact until the very last moment. The victim never saw it coming. What happened next was fast, controlled, and devastating. There was no chaotic struggle, no desperate shouting for help. By the time the realization hit, it was already irreversible. The crime was not fueled by rage in that moment. It was fueled by weeks of preparation. When it was over, he didn't panic. He cleaned carefully. He followed the steps he had memorized. He removed evidence methodically, understanding that mistakes came from rushing. Every action was deliberate. Every movement was calm. Then he left the house and continued his day. Hours passed before anyone noticed something was wrong. Missed calls were dismissed as busy schedules. Messages went unanswered but not immediately alarming. It wasn't until routine failed, when the victim didn't show up where they were expected, that concern turned into action. By the time authorities became involved, the scene had been altered enough to delay answers. There were questions but no immediate conclusions. The neighborhood remained quiet, unaware that a crime had already reshaped its reality, and he remained exactly where no one would suspect him to be. Close. The investigation began quietly, just like the crime itself. There were no flashing lights at first, no dramatic discoveries that forced immediate answers. Instead, there was uncertainty. A person who had vanished without warning, leaving behind a routine that suddenly stopped making sense. When investigators first entered the house, nothing appeared obviously wrong. Furniture was in place. There were no visible signs of violence. The space looked lived in, normal, almost carefully preserved. That absence of chaos complicated everything. Crimes without disorder often suggest consent, accident, or disappearance by choice, and that assumption bought him more time. He cooperated fully. He answered questions calmly, expressing concern in a way that seemed appropriate but never excessive. He described the victim as independent, busy, sometimes unpredictable. He suggested stress, distance, and the possibility of leaving without notice. Nothing he said could be disproven immediately, but something felt off. Experienced investigators know that inconsistencies don't always show up in words. Sometimes they appear in timing, in pauses that last just a second too long, in details offered without being asked. He spoke clearly, but his answers were rehearsed, as if he had already anticipated every question. As the days passed, attention shifted outward. Friends were interviewed. Co-workers were questioned. Digital footprints were examined. Slowly, the idea of a voluntary disappearance began to collapse. There were future plans that had not been abandoned, appointments that had not been cancelled, messages that stopped mid-conversation. This wasn't someone starting over. It was someone who had been stopped. The focus returned to the house. Forensic teams re-entered the space with a different approach. This time, they weren't looking for violence. They were looking for absence, missing items, cleaned areas that didn't match the rest of the room, subtle disruptions that suggested something had been removed rather than left behind. That's when they noticed it. One section of flooring had been cleaned more thoroughly than the rest. Not suspicious at first glance, but inconsistent under detailed examination. Traces that couldn't be seen by the naked eye told a different story. Something had happened there, and someone had tried very hard to erase it. Pressure began to build. He noticed the change immediately. The visits became more frequent, the questions more specific. He remained composed, but the cracks were forming internally. Maintaining a constructed reality requires constant control, and control becomes harder as the net tightens. Investigators expanded their search. They reviewed location data, tracking movements that aligned too perfectly with his statements. They examined transactions, noticing gaps that suggested unaccounted time. They reconstructed the day piece by piece, comparing his version with objective records. The timeline didn't align. Confronted with these discrepancies, he adjusted his story slightly, just enough to explain the mismatch. But every adjustment created a new problem. Each correction pulled another thread loose. Eventually, the search moved beyond the house. Remote areas connected to his routine became points of interest, places he had been familiar with for years, locations that offered privacy, distance, and time. What was once background scenery now became central to the investigation. The discovery came unexpectedly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't immediate closure. It was confirmation, evidence that removed doubt and replaced it with certainty. At that moment, the case stopped being a mystery and became a confrontation. When he was brought in again, the tone changed. There was no aggression, no raised voices, just facts placed carefully on the table. Evidence he hadn't known existed, details he believed were hidden forever. With each revelation, his control weakened. Silence filled the room. For the first time, he wasn't leading the conversation. He listened. He watched. His mind searched for exits that no longer existed. The image he had crafted so carefully was collapsing under the weight of reality. And then he spoke. Not with emotion, not with regret, but with explanation. He described feeling ignored, replaced, losing control over a future he believed was owed to him. He framed his actions as logical outcomes, not moral failures. Responsibility was shifted. Justification replaced accountability. But justification doesn't change facts. The case moved forward swiftly after that. Once the truth surfaced, it couldn't be pushed back into silence. The community reacted with shock, struggling to reconcile the image they had known with the reality they were forced to accept. The house was no longer just a house. It became a reminder of how easily danger can hide behind familiarity, how control can disguise itself as care, how trust, once broken, leaves damage that extends far beyond a single life. In the end, the quiet routine that once protected him became the evidence that exposed him. Every predictable habit, every repeated pattern, every unnoticed detail worked against him once seen clearly. The crime was not impulsive. It was not accidental. It was the result of a mindset that valued control over humanity and planning over empathy. And that is what made it truly terrifying. Because if it could happen there behind closed doors without warning, it could happen anywhere,